It is the 22nd of January, 1967. Virgil Grissom walks into his own backyard, pulls a lemon from a tree, and carries it to work with him. He does not explain the joke to reporters, though by then he has already told them plenty about how he feels. Problems, he has said, are coming in bushelfuls. Grissom hangs the lemon on the spacecraft simulator, a training model of the machine that will soon carry him and 2 other men into space, and he leaves it there for everyone in the building to see. Nobody who works there needs the joke explained. For months, the crew has been finding wiring nobody logged, hardware nobody finished, and a smell in the oxygen line that nobody can identify. In 5 days, Grissom will be strapped into the real spacecraft for a test that almost nobody at the Space Center considers dangerous. He will not walk away from it. Neither will the 2 men beside him. This is the story of Apollo 1, and it does not start with a countdown. It starts on the ground, in a spacecraft that never left the launch pad, in a test that almost nobody outside the space program had heard of, until it killed 3 men. This channel breaks down real space discoveries without the exaggeration, and this particular story does not need any help from us to matter. If that is the kind of history you want told plainly, subscribe, because getting this one exactly right is the whole point. By 1967, the United States had spent 6 years chasing a promise President Kennedy made to Congress with no rocket built and no spacecraft designed to make it true, that Americans would land on the moon before the decade was out. The Soviet Union had already claimed nearly every earlier milestone. Sputnik reached orbit first, in the autumn of 1957. Yuri Gagarin reached space first, in the spring of 1961, only weeks before Alan Shepard's own flight followed it. NASA was under enormous pressure to close that gap fast, without losing anyone in the process. The 3 men chosen to fly the first crewed Apollo mission were not handed a formality. Gus Grissom had flown combat missions over Korea as an Air Force fighter pilot before he ever applied to be an astronaut. And by 1967, he had already flown 2 space flights, the second American in space after Shepard and commander of the first crewed Gemini mission. He had also survived one hatch nearly killing him already, when the hatch on his Mercury capsule blew open early after splashdown and the spacecraft sank, an accident nobody at NASA ever fully explained to his satisfaction. Ed White, a West Point graduate and former Air Force pilot, had become the first American to walk in space on the 3rd of June, 1965, floating outside his Gemini capsule for roughly 20 minutes with nothing between him and the vacuum but a suit and a tether. When Mission Control finally ordered him back inside, White told them it was the saddest moment of his life. Roger Chaffee was the youngest of the 3 at 31, an Eagle Scout and a Purdue-trained aeronautical engineer who had never flown in space at all and would be flying his first mission in the seat behind the other 2. Responsible for keeping the spacecraft talking to the ground. Grissom would command. White would handle the hatch and the cabin systems. Chaffee would run communications. On paper, it was exactly the crew you would choose to fly the hardest, riskiest part of a moon program. The mission itself, once launched, was supposed to keep the 3 of them in Earth orbit for 14 days, testing the command and service module before NASA trusted it to carry a crew toward the moon. Grissom had told a reporter, not long before the fire, that he doubted the spacecraft was ready to complete even that. He had reason to doubt it. Command Module number 12 had arrived at Kennedy Space Center that August, with more than 100 significant items still unfinished. The kind of gap that would be like you accepting delivery of a new car with more than 100 items still listed as open on the invoice. Engineers at North American Aviation, the company building it, kept finding more after delivery, 623 additional engineering changes in total, on top of everything still open when the spacecraft first arrived. Grissom, White, and Chaffee had already sat through a formal review of the spacecraft that summer and raised serious concerns about flammable material inside the cabin, mostly nylon netting and a fabric fastener called Velcro, used to hold down loose tools and equipment. The program manager, Joseph Shea, passed the spacecraft anyway and ordered North American to strip the flammable material out. As a joke about how much faith they had in that promise, the crew gave Shea a photograph of the 3 of them with their heads bowed and hands folded, as if praying over a model of the capsule. The caption, in Grissom's own handwriting, read, "It isn't that we don't trust you, Joe, but this time we've decided to go over your head." It was funny because it was true. Within days of that order to remove the flammable material, the spacecraft was delivered to the Cape with much of it already back inside. Part of why fire was such a live danger in that cabin came down to a decision made years earlier, about what the crew would actually breathe. NASA had chosen to fill the cabin, both in flight and during ground tests like this one, with pure oxygen rather than a blend of oxygen and nitrogen like the air filling the room you are sitting in right now. In flight, that choice made real sense. A cabin running on pure oxygen could operate at a much lower pressure than a nitrogen mix and still keep a crew alert, which meant a lighter spacecraft and no risk of the sickness that comes from breathing nitrogen under pressure and then dropping that pressure too fast. If you have ever heard a scuba diver warned never to surface too quickly, that is the same danger in reverse. Gas instead of water, and it is exactly what engineers were trying to avoid. But on the ground, before launch, engineers pressurize that same pure oxygen slightly above the normal pressure of the air around you in order to check the cabin seals properly. Pure oxygen at that pressure does not just support a flame. It turns ordinary cabin material, the kind of cloth that would only scorch under a lit match in your own living room, into something closer to a gasoline-soaked rag. Keep that fact in mind. It is going to matter in less than 10 minutes of test time. By the morning of January 27th, that same pure oxygen system had already been used safely inside this exact cabin during 2 earlier ground tests, one with the prime crew that October and one with the backup crew that December, the longer of the two holding the astronauts under full oxygen pressure for more than 6 hours. Nobody treated the plugs out test that day as hazardous because the rocket underneath the capsule held no fuel and no live explosive charges, and NASA's own paperwork listed it as one of the safer exercises left before launch. Grissom, White, and Chaffee suited up that afternoon and were sealed inside the capsule shortly after 1 o'clock. Almost immediately, Grissom reported a strange smell in his oxygen supply, something like sour buttermilk, and the countdown held while ground crews searched for the source. They never found it. The countdown held again, roughly an hour later, for a different problem, a communications loop connecting the crew to the operations building, and the blockhouse kept filling with static, cutting Grissom off mid-sentence. Frustrated, he said something into the microphone that would be remembered for a very different reason within the hour. "How are we going to get to the moon?" he asked, "if we can't talk between 2 or 3 buildings?" It was 6:20 that evening, and the countdown was holding at 10 minutes before liftoff this test was never actually going to attempt. At 6:31, an electrical arc found the one thing pure oxygen at that pressure had been waiting for. A voice on the recording, believed to be Grissom, said something short, most likely the single word, "fire." 2 seconds later, a second voice, believed to be Chaffee, reported it formally to the blockhouse. "We have a fire in the cockpit. In pure oxygen at that pressure, flame does not spread the way it does in ordinary air." Within seconds, cabin pressure climbed so high that the inner wall of the capsule ruptured outward, and flame and smoke burst through the access panels around it, driving back the ground crew trying to reach the hatch. The hatch itself was the kind of design used since Mercury and Gemini, a heavy plug sealed shut by the cabin's own internal pressure, meant to be opened from inside only after that pressure had first been vented down. With the pressure spiking instead of falling, nobody inside or outside the capsule could move it. It took rescue workers roughly 5 minutes to cut through all 3 layers of hatch between them and the crew. By then, it was already over. Grissom, White, and Chaffee died within seconds of the rupture, from cardiac arrest brought on by the toxic gas filling the cabin. It happened 19 seconds past 6:31 in the evening, Eastern Time, on the 27th of January, 1967, on a launch pad in a spacecraft that had not moved an inch. The specific danger was not even a new one. 6 years earlier, in March of 1961, a Soviet cosmonaut trainee named Valentin Bondarenko had died after a fire broke out in an oxygen-rich test chamber during his own training on the ground. The Soviet Union kept both his death and his identity as a cosmonaut secret for close to 2 decades, so nobody at NASA in 1967 had any way to learn from what had already happened once before. For a long moment afterward, almost nobody at Kennedy Space Center said anything at all. It took more than 7 hours before anyone could safely enter the capsule and recover the 3 men inside, and the workers who did that job kept largely silent about it for the rest of their lives. What matters for this story is not what that cabin looked like afterward. It is what 3 families were told that night and what an entire space program had to decide to do next. 6 days earlier, a lemon had been hanging on a simulator as a joke about problems nobody had fixed in time. Nobody was laughing anymore. NASA's first decision afterward was almost a small one, about a name. There was no permanent public mission title yet, only an internal engineering number. Grissom, White, and Chaffee's widows asked that the name Apollo 1 be reserved permanently for the mission their husbands had trained for and never got to fly. NASA agreed. That spring, the agency's leadership formally recorded the flight as Apollo 1, the first crewed Apollo Saturn mission, failed on a ground test. No spacecraft would ever fly again carrying a lower Apollo number. Missions 2 and 3 were simply never used by anyone. It is a small piece of paperwork, and it is also one of the few moments in this whole story where an institution moved to honor grief before it moved to protect itself. Within a day, NASA convened a formal accident review board, led by Floyd Thompson, director of the Langley Research Center, and including astronaut Frank Borman and spacecraft designer Maxime Faget among its members. Over the following 10 weeks, the board took apart what remained of the capsule piece by piece, and its final report did not spare the program that built it. Investigators traced the most likely ignition point to a stretch of silver-plated wiring near the environmental control unit, close to a joint in the tubing that carried liquid coolant through the cabin. The insulation on that wire had been repeatedly rubbed and nicked by a small access door, opened and closed many times during testing. Laboratory work afterward showed that damaged silver wire sitting near a coolant leak could trigger a violent chemical reaction in pure oxygen, more than enough to start a fire on its own. The board could not prove that exact wire caused this exact fire. It listed several possible arcs and declined to name one with total certainty, which is its own kind of honesty, rarely offered so plainly in an accident report. What the board could state without any doubt was how much fuel that spark had to work with. Investigators found roughly 34 square feet of Velcro fastener alone inside the cabin, close to enough to carpet the room you're sitting in right now, alongside nylon netting and other padding, all of it sitting inside a pressurized, pure oxygen environment that made ordinary comparisons to household fire risk almost meaningless. Astronaut Buzz Aldrin later wrote that flammable material removed from the cabin that August, after Shay's order in the crew's prayer photograph, had quietly found its way back inside before the spacecraft ever reached the Cape. Nobody was ever formally charged with deciding that. It was simply how the program had been run. Then there was the hatch. Engineers building Mercury had used an outward opening hatch with explosive bolts, the same kind of hatch that had blown open early on Grissom's own capsule years before. Partly because of that history, NASA had insisted Gemini and Apollo use a hatch that opened inward and had to be worked by hand, with no explosives involved anywhere near the crew. It was safer against an accidental opening in orbit, and it was far more dangerous in a fire on the ground, a trade the review board did not think anyone had weighed carefully enough. The board also found that the test itself had never been classified as hazardous in the first place, despite earlier oxygen fires elsewhere in the space program, so no fire crew, rescue team, or medical staff were stationed at the pad that evening. The gas masks kept nearby were built for toxic fumes, not for thick smoke, and the walkways around the capsule were crowded with steps, sliding doors, and tight turns that slowed down the men trying to reach the hatch. None of these were separate accidents. They were the same failure, told 5 different ways, a program that had let ordinary cautions slide one schedule pressure and one signed-off exception at a time. The fire did not stay contained to engineering. Weeks into the investigation, Senator Walter Mondale revealed the existence of an internal NASA document known as the Phillips Report, a blunt assessment written more than a year earlier by Apollo program director Samuel Phillips, cataloging serious quality and schedule failures at North American Aviation. Phillips had led a team of NASA engineers through North American's own plants and had personally warned the company's president, John Atwood, that its work on Apollo fell well short of what the program needed. NASA's own administrator, James Webb, had apparently not known the document existed. Congress ultimately concluded that the Phillips report had not caused the fire and was not directly connected to it, but the hearings still forced a hard question into the open about whether NASA had been honest with the country about the true condition of the hardware it was flying. North American's chief engineer, Harrison Storms, was forced out. Joseph Shea, the manager who had passed the spacecraft that August and then watched 3 men he had worked beside for years die inside it, did not recover from the fire in any professional sense. He was moved out of the Apollo program within 6 months into a job he considered meaningless and resigned soon after. None of that repaired anything. It simply marked how far the damage reached, past 3 families and into careers, reputations, and an entire agency's sense of itself. What actually changed the outcome was slower and far less dramatic than any hearing, and it took 20 months. Engineers replaced the launch cabin atmosphere with a mix of roughly 60% oxygen and 40% nitrogen at ordinary sea level pressure, far less prone to flash fire than pure oxygen had been, then vented most of that mixture away during ascent until the spacecraft settled into pure oxygen, at the low pressure it had always needed once it reached space. Astronauts would still breathe pure oxygen inside their own suits before launch, to guard against decompression sickness, but the cabin around them no longer would. Engineers pulled the nylon suits Grissom, White, and Chaffee had worn out of production entirely and replaced them with a new fabric called beta cloth, woven from fiberglass and coated to resist melting rather than burning. Aluminum coolant tubing, the kind that had leaked and helped feed the fire, was replaced with brazed stainless steel. Every wire and pipe in the cabin received new insulation, new routing, and new inspection standards. During an earlier inspection of their own capsule, workers had found a stray wrench socket left inside it by mistake, a small telling sign of how casually the assembly process had been documented up to that point. Afterward, engineers began documenting the spacecraft's construction so thoroughly that a mistake like that became close to impossible to miss. And the hatch, the single detail that turned a survivable fire into a fatal one, was completely redesigned to open outward in under 5 seconds. faster than you could count it out loud, using a small charge of pressurized gas rather than the explosive bolts NASA had always feared. 3 days after the fire, Flight Director Gene Kranz gathered his team in Houston and told them plainly that the program had been too eager about its own schedule and had, in his own words, blocked out all of the problems that schedule was creating. From now on, he told them, everyone in that room would be tough, meaning forever accountable for whatever they signed off on, and competent, meaning they would never again take anything for granted. Mission control, he told them, will be perfect. It became something close to scripture inside NASA, repeated for decades afterward, including more than 35 years later after the shuttle Columbia was lost in 2003. The three widows did not disappear from the story after 1967. Betty Grissom sued North American Rockwell for wrongful death and settled in 1972 for $350,000, worth roughly $2 million today, a settlement that in turn set the terms for smaller payments to Pat White and Martha Chaffee. Nearly 2 decades later, after the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart in 1986, Betty Grissom was one of the people who pushed the families of that crew to pursue their own legal case, and her own attorney went on to represent one of the Challenger widows directly. In 1984, she helped found what became the Astronaut Scholarship Foundation, which still funds science and engineering students today. She died in October of 2018, at 91 years old, having outlived her husband by more than 50 years, and she is buried beside him at Arlington National Cemetery. Pat White's story did not end as steadily. She raised the couple's 2 children in Houston and eventually remarried, staying mostly out of public view for years afterward. In September of 1983, not long after surgery to remove a tumor, she took her own life. This story does not need to dwell on that, only to acknowledge it, because the cost of one January evening in 1967 did not stop being paid once the cameras left the launch pad. Martha Chaffee raised her own 2 children more quietly still, largely outside the public record this story has been able to verify. 3 men died on that pad. The weight of it did not fall on 3 people alone. It is a fair question whether any of this cost the country its own deadline. Kennedy had promised a landing before the end of the decade, and the fire forced a 20-month pause in every crewed Apollo flight while engineers rebuilt the spacecraft from the wiring out. Plenty of people at the time feared that pause had ended any real chance of meeting Kennedy's date at all. Most engineers and historians who have studied the record since have leaned toward something close to the opposite conclusion, though they are careful to call it a judgment rather than a proven fact. The paused schedule left room to keep testing the lunar module and the Saturn V rocket without a crew aboard, catching hardware failures on the ground instead of in flight, where there would have been no way back from them. When Apollo 7 finally flew in October of 1968, it carried the fixed, rebuilt Block 2 spacecraft into orbit, flown by the very backup crew who had trained alongside Grissom, White, and Chaffee for years, Wally Schirra, Don Eisel, and Walter Cunningham. It worked cleanly. 11 months later, in July of 1969, Apollo 11 carried Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins to the surface of the moon inside a spacecraft built to standards that existed only because 3 men had already died, proving the old ones were not good enough. NASA still sets aside a week every January, close to this anniversary, to remember the people the space program has lost on the way to somewhere else. Apollo 1 alongside the shuttle crews of Challenger and Columbia who came later. It is a quiet observance, not a broadcast event, and most years it draws little outside attention. That quietness is not neglect. It is closer to how the people who actually build spacecraft choose to grieve, plainly, on a schedule, without asking anyone to watch. Grissom, White, and Chaffee are remembered today in small, scattered ways that go unnoticed by nearly everyone who is not looking for them. 3 stars carry nicknames the crew invented themselves during training. Grissom's middle name, Ivan, spelled backward became one. The word second, for Edward White II, spelled backward became another. Chaffee's own first name, Roger, spelled backward became the third. Those nicknames are still printed on some navigation charts today. Grissom received the Congressional Space Medal of Honor from President Carter in 1978. White and Chaffee did not receive theirs until 1997, 3 full decades after they died, awarded by President Clinton, 2 administrations removed from the one that had made the original promise to reach the moon. At the old Launch Complex 34 in Florida, where the test happened, nothing was ever rebuilt. The pad structure came down years later, but the concrete base still stands, with a plaque for each man, and since 2005, a granite bench bearing each of their names. Families still gather there most Januaries. If you have ever stood in front of a war memorial and read a name you did not recognize, you already know roughly what that bench feels like to a stranger. Ask a stranger today to name the 3 astronauts who died getting the moon program ready to actually reach the moon, and plenty will come up empty. Ask the same stranger to name the 3 who reached it first, and they will not hesitate. A lemon on a simulator was a joke about a program moving faster than it could fix its own mistakes. 6 days later, the mistakes caught up with 3 men who had already told everyone, plainly and on the record, that they were worried. Nothing about what happened to Grissom, White, and Chaffee needed exaggeration then, and it needs none now, 60 years later. What it needed, and eventually got, was an agency willing to rebuild a spacecraft from the wiring out and admit its own failure in public, in front of Congress and in front of the families of the men it had killed. That is a harder thing for any institution to do than it sounds, and it belongs in this story alongside the grief. Some of you watching this remember exactly where you were the week it happened, and that memory is worth more than anything we could dramatize in its place. If you want more of the space program's history told this plainly, with names attached to both the blame and the credit, subscribe to this channel. Elsewhere in that same decade sits the story of the backup crew who flew the mission Grissom. White and Chaffee never got to fly themselves, carrying every lesson from this one into orbit for the first time. That is a story worth telling properly, another time. Thank you for watching, and for still remembering 3 names that history nearly let slip.